and welcome to the Christ and Culture webcast. I'm your host, Taylor DeSoto. Today, I will be reading an article from my blog, youngtextlessreformed.com, called Why the Doctrine of Inerrancy Demands the Defense of the Received Text. On my blog, I have highlighted many of the doctrinal errors underpinning the modern critical text. I have also set forth positively what I consider to be the historical orthodox position on the Holy Scriptures. I have been quite critical of the doctrine of inerrancy, which might make some people uncomfortable, as set forth by modern scholars, as well as the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy. I've also compared that to the doctrine of providential preservation, which is the historical Protestant view, and demonstrated how these two doctrines are quite different. Now, that is not to say that the doctrine of inerrancy is all bad or completely bad or totally bad, though it has a critical flaw which I highlight in an article linked in the article in the description. For those that do not have time to read my lengthy articles, the essential flaw with the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy and inerrancy itself is that it founds the great accuracy of the text of Holy Scripture on modern text critical methods which cannot come to a final product, and thus allows for a changing, supposedly inerrant text. In this article that I'm going to read for you right now, I will demonstrate why the current articulation of inerrancy not only undercuts any meaningful doctrine of Scripture, but also undercuts any meaningful argument in opposition to the received text. So if a proponent of the modern critical text adheres to the doctrine of inerrancy, as they usually do, as opposed to the historical definition of providential preservation as stated in Westminster Confession 1:8, they have no grounds for attacking the received text. I am defining inerrancy here as the doctrine which teaches that the original manuscripts of the New Testament were without error, and that those originals have been preserved in all that they teach in the extant copies, but the actual matter, the material, the words have changed. This is in opposition to providential preservation, which teaches that in every age the Holy Scriptures have been kept pure, not only in what they teach, but also preserved in the words from which those teachings are derived. Words have meaning, words create doctrines. If you change the words, it's very easy to change a doctrine, and that's what happens. If one limits the doctrine of inerrancy to only the autographs, then the defense of the Scriptures, I argue, is essentially pointless because we have no original to compare to. So if it is the case, as the doctrine of inerrancy teaches, that the Scriptures are without error in all that they teach, while at the same time the words of that text are changing, well, then it must also be said that the material text of the Scriptures can change and the Bible still be inerrant, so as long as they can be said to teach the same doctrines. So if no doctrine has been affected, and this is really the linchpin here, if no doctrine is affected between the Reformation-era printed Greek texts and the modern critical printed Greek texts, then the necessary conclusion is that both are inerrant or neither are inerrant. Since, according to the modern critical perspective, the Reformation-era text teaches the same doctrines as the critical text, everything necessary for salvation, then according to the modern doctrinal formulation of inerrancy, well, the Reformation-era text must be inerrant too. If, then, the Reformation-era text teaches the same doctrines and is therefore inerrant, advocates of the modern critical text have no argument against it from their own theological perspective. Now, one might go on to say, well, the received text is inerrant insofar as it represents the original, so it's not totally inerrant. It has a lot of inerrant passages, but some of them are not inerrant. Now, the problem with this is that they have no ability to determine which passages are inerrant and which are not. That is why, consistently, modern apologists and scholars and advocates of the modern critical text will not give you an original text to compare anything to. So even if even if they were to present a perfect text to you that they say, hey, this is it, this is original, well, according to inerrancy, there's no original to compare to, and thus no way to validate that what they have produced is inerrant. And that is why you have famous scholars like Dan Wallace saying, even if we did have the original, we simply wouldn't know that we had the original. So this is a huge problem with their position. So we're going back to the assumption that no doctrine is affected. They essentially have to say that. It's not that they actually believe that no doctrine is affected as a part of their critical position. It's that they actually have to claim that no doctrine is affected. Well, why? Because they're changing the text. So if the words change, then the meaning cannot, or they lose the doctrine of inerrancy entirely. So this is the logical end of the claim that no doctrine is affected. So if no doctrine is affected between the Reformation era printed Greek texts and the modern critical printed Greek texts, then the necessary conclusion is that both are inerrant. This is an important observation because it means that opponents of the received text have no theological warrants to attack the text of the Reformation, seeing as by their own theological standard, it is inerrant. So until they say that there is a final text, this is it, we're holding it, and it actually teaches different doctrine, not only is it inconsistent to attack the received text, which allegedly no doctrine is affected between the two, it's actually hostile to attack the text of Holy Scripture as set forth in the Reformation era text by their own doctrinal standard. So it stands against reason that a modern critical text proponent would actually attack a text which by their own theological standard is inerrant. So in order to responsibly attack the received text from a modern critical vantage point, there would have to be three things that they would be willing to admit. The first is that they must admit that doctrine is affected between text. There are changes that have affected the sense or the meaning of the scriptures between these two texts, and therefore this is why we would attack that text. It's not a Bible. Now, interestingly enough, they actually will argue for that, just not directly. For example, Dr. Andrew Naselli, in his textbook How to Understand and Apply the New Testament, argues that the KJV and NKJV should not be used at all, not even in private devotions. However, he advocates that the NLT and the Message should be used. So what would you say about a Bible that is less valuable than the Message? Well, that it's not a Bible. So it seems that they actually do argue that the KJV and NKJV are not Bibles, though they would never say it. Why? Because that would mean they would have to admit that, well, they don't believe in inerrancy. The second thing that they would have to say is that they must adopt a final and stable text to serve as a point of comparison, not only between that and the received text, but also that in the original, which they don't have. Third, they must assert that the received text is not inerrant and thus not scripture. Like I stated before, they all but say that, but they would never directly say that, as they know that it would mean that they rejected inerrancy. So, stating these things, of course, is impossible for a modern critical text advocate, since the modern critical text is changing and will continue to change, and honestly, they have no grounds upon which to claim that their text is better than any other text, seeing as their own standard says that a comparison to the original would be the only thing to validate that their text is inerrant. And since they can't do that, well, they're out of luck. Since according to the modern doctrinal standard of inerrancy, the Bible is without error in all that it sets forth or teaches, any Bible that is without error in all that it teaches, well, is inerrant and actually should be defended as inerrant. If at the same time a proponent of the modern doctrine of the modern critical text and inerrancy wishes to add a component of providence to the equation, then they especially and necessarily have to defend the received text. See, if providence is considered, there is no change to Holy Scripture based on text-critical principles that can affect the teaching of the Scriptures. You've heard this constantly. No doctrine is affected, and they stand on that very consistently. Consequently, if one were to argue that changes to the printed text of Holy Scripture can affect doctrine and preaching and theology, which ironically they do, then the doctrine of inerrancy must be rejected outright, as previous articulations and iterations of that text would have necessarily contained doctrines that were improved upon and thus erred prior to those changes. See, that's the nature of something that changes. It's imperfect. That's why God is immutable. He does not change. Anything that changes necessarily has error. And so if you admit that there is a changing text, you necessarily reject inerrancy. So if a change introduced by text-critical methods changes doctrine, then the critical text simply cannot be inerrant. This presents a theological challenge to those who wish to continue to advocate against the received text and also wish to uphold inerrancy of a changing modern critical text. There are two necessary conclusions that must be drawn from this reality. It's kind of an either or, and if you can present a third option, I'd be glad to hear it, and I'll interact with it at a later time. Put it in the comments. But the dichotomy is as such. One, either the scriptures are inerrant and text-critical changes cannot affect doctrine, and thus the received text must be inerrant along with the modern critical text. Two, or the scriptures are simply not inerrant, as the changes introduced by new modern text-critical methods will and do change doctrine. The necessary conclusion of maintaining that the words of Scripture have changed and will change, and that these words are inerrant, is that those material changes must not affect doctrine. If it is the case that these changes will affect doctrine, then the Bible is necessarily not inerrant, and the conversation is now far outside the realm of even what would be considered modern Orthodox standards. So the question we should all be asking is this: if no doctrine is affected between the received text and the modern critical text, and the Bible is inerrant, why do modern critical text advocates attack a supposedly inerrant Bible such as the received text? Is it consistent to affirm the modern doctrine of inerrancy and to also simultaneously attack the historical Protestant scriptures? It seems that the answer is no. It is simply not consistent. One might argue that the modern critical text is better, but in what way? If no doctrine is affected, how is it better? In order to make an argument for the text being better, one first has to argue that doctrine has indeed changed, and thus admit that the scriptures are not inerrant. And even if one were to admit that the modern critical text is better, and admit that the Reformation era Bible is not inerrant, they would need to produce a standard, stable text to defend their claim, to hold up and say, well, this one is inerrant. They won't do that. So until the advocates of the modern critical text are willing to admit that doctrine has changed, and thus Scripture is not inerrant, they simply are attacking the received text, which by their own doctrinal standard is inerrant. This article should demonstrate one of the chief inconsistencies of those who uphold inerrancy of Scripture and also attack the received text of the Reformation. It seems, based on the axiom that no doctrine is affected, there is actually no warrant to attack any version of the Scriptures that is inerrant. In order to do so, one would have to adopt the view that Scriptures have been kept pure in both what they teach and the words that teach those doctrines, ironically. And then they would have to defend that finished text. And that's the great sin of the received text position, is that we say the words are preserved. That's the great sin. So in order to attack the received text, you would have to do what the modern critical text proponents disagree about the received text position. So if it is the case that the Bible has been kept pure in all ages and is providentially preserved, then it stands that adopting a critical text which differs from the text of the previous era of the church simply cannot be justified in the first place and is actually incompatible with any argument against the received text. So I'm looking forward to seeing anyone who can possibly provide a reason for how inerrancy can be upheld while words are changing and yet at the same time still attack the received text as though it's not inerrant. You either have to say that, yes, doctrines have been changed, these are the doctrines that have been changed, these are the passages that are absolutely not original, and then defend that text against the received text to make the argument. Since no one is willing to do that from the modern critical text perspective, attacking the Reformation era received text is simply absurd. So I argue, in short, that they should be wholehearted received text defenders. According to their own formulation of inerrancy, their own doctrine of Scripture, this necessarily is the case. This has been a reading of an article from my blog, youngtextusreformed.com. Thank you for watching. This has been Christ and Culture with your host, Taylor DeSoto. May the Lord bless you and keep you, and we will see you next time.